70 years ago, a revolution took place that changed all of our lives in Britain.
We're out to improve the health of every family and the whole nation.
Its name, the National Health Service. We're taking a look at the NHS then and now.
We've got a picture of your brain.
To see how much it's changed.
70 years ago, there was no emergency medicine. I don't quite know what happened if you were unwell.
And what stayed the same.
She didn't think I was going to make it. Well, nobody thought I was going to make it.
Through the eyes of staff and patients.
This is all about prolonging life rather than a cure, and I'd recommend anyone to try it.
And their extraordinary medical stories.
They told us that her for the worst and had to let her go, take her in my arms and let her go.
I'm Fern Britton, and without the NHS, I don't think I'd be alive today. This is the story of Matron, medicine, and me. I'm in Buckinghamshire, on the way to Stoke Mandeville Hospital. 2 years ago, I took this route in an ambulance because I was very ill. It was July 2016, and I was being rushed to resus in A&E in immense pain. What was odd about the experience, however, was that I'd just been in hospital a few days previously, having a hysterectomy, which had gone well. But back at home, after a few days, I started to have immense pain. So much so that my daughter called 999. And I'll be honest, I genuinely knew I was dying, and all I could think about was my 4 children and husband. It was frightening. Thankfully, someone was there to be at my bedside in my hour of need, and that is who I'm meeting up with first today. Deborah Sumner is a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist who had delivered my 2 baby girls. It's fair to say, if anyone knew what was going on inside my body, it was her.
I remember coming in to resus, being called in to see you. How were you feeling at that time?
I was feeling iller than I've ever felt. Tremendous pain in my stomach. And I'd been bundled into the ambulance, given gas and air. Thankfully, I was able to tell the medical staff about my hysterectomy operation 4 days earlier, which Deborah immediately latched onto.
When you've got somebody who's post-operatively who's unwell, we're taught 3 things: wind, water, wound. So wind is look at the chest, make sure there's no chest infection.
I wouldn't have thought of that, because I had another bit of wind as well. But
yes. Water is make sure there's not a urinary tract infection, and wound is look at the wound, because that's the most likely source of any sepsis in that situation.
Deborah had diagnosed sepsis, an acute medical condition caused by infection that kills 44,000 people a year in the UK. So what are the signs then that said, yes, this is sepsis, this is the infection being E. coli, could be anything, but it was E. coli for me, has now gone berserk and my body is not responding well?
Basically the clinical symptoms, the high heart rate, the blood pressure, the temperature, and generally unwell. And then you put that together with the blood tests, the history, and the most likely thing is that there is a serious infection.
Deborah immediately prescribed antibiotics to combat the infection, but she also ordered a scan which revealed massive abscesses in my abdomen full of fluid, which was lethally toxic for my body. If it had burst, if the abscess had burst, would that have been
that can be
big danger?
Really dangerous. Whereas this infection was contained at the top of the vagina primarily. If that bursts into the abdomen, that can be a very serious situation.
By the time the doctors discovered the septic abscesses, I was in a bad way. So bad, in fact, that taking just antibiotics or medicine of any type wouldn't be enough to save my life. My vital organs were at risk of shutting down, and the doctors decided they had to drain the toxic abscesses causing the sepsis. I needed immediate surgery. Fearing I wouldn't come out the other side, I took off my wedding ring and gave it to my daughter. Like the 260,000 patients diagnosed each year with sepsis in the UK, 1 in 5 of whom don't survive, I was afraid I was about to become a statistic. But today, for the first time, I'm back where that operation took place. So, this is the operating theatre. Geraldine Tasker was the surgeon who quite literally held my life in her hands and, spoiler alert, saved my life.
Oh, I'm so pleased to see you. I can't tell you. Thank you so much.
My goodness, that was a brilliant job, and I'll never forget you. You know that.
Well, it's what we do. This is what the NHS is about. This is the team that's here to help people, and that's why we do the work we're doing.
You saved me, because it could easily have gone wrong, and it didn't.
No.
And you know, there's a thank you. Thank you. It's lovely to see you and say thank you properly.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a big moment, really, in my life. Geraldine had not only drained enough liquid from the abscesses to allow the antibiotics to start working, but she also managed to do it without having to resort to cutting me open. Waking up and in recovery, and the nurse saying to me, "It's all over." I said, "Did they cut me?" She said, "No."
We did the anaesthetic, and I was able to scan your abdomen to see exactly where the collection was, and then using a needle I was able to aspirate to sample the contents of the fluid and remove that.
Yes.
We removed about 30 mils, and
30 mils sounds a lot.
well,
To
the
me.
collection was a reasonable size. It wasn't as much, unfortunately. It was a fairly organised collection, so I would have preferred that we'd drained more.
I remember the next morning you came in and you said to me, I've been thinking about you all night and you're still nil by mouth and I think we might have to go in again. And I went, no, we're fine. Keep all this up, this is fine.
You had been very ill, and you know, as I said, I was worried that we perhaps hadn't sampled sufficient fluid, but from that point forward, you turned the corner and things, you started to get better.
Yes, they did. Of course, my fight with E. coli and sepsis was just one isolated battle in the history of the NHS. But when it comes to infectious diseases, it's been a 70-year-long war.
A dangerous bit of work, that.
Yeah. But that's a darn sight more dangerous.
What do you mean? You ought to be ashamed of yourself.
Perfectly disgraceful. The man ought to be prosecuted.
When the service got underway in 1948, the campaign against germs was at the forefront of its mission. With millions returning from foreign fighting, and with the nation weak and hungry from 6 years of conflict, the fear was that disease would spread. So, the Ministry of Health came up with a slogan.
Excellent. Remember, coughs and sneezes spread diseases.
Good advice to this day. Thankfully, however, there was a bigger plan to tackle things, in the form of the all-new National Health Service. Part of its stated mission was to rid the country of infectious disease. But my story, and so many thousands of others, is proof that it's a war that's yet to be won completely. So, what is sepsis? Julia is a lead nurse who deals with this life-threatening condition on a daily basis.
So sepsis is when infection gets out of control. So it's when the body starts to attack its own tissues and organs. So it is life-threatening.
Over the years, people have slipped through the net and died and nobody really knew why.
I think we've always known about it, but we've called it different things. So blood poisoning or septicemia. Equally, for those that perhaps have died from pneumonia or meningitis, what they've actually probably died of is sepsis.
Really?
So it's always been there. I think we probably catalogue the numbers better than we ever did, but there's so much work still to be done.
The E. coli that caused my sepsis is all around us, mostly living in the gut. And for the most part, our immune systems deal with it. But if we are sick or recovering from trauma, like a hysterectomy, then the infection, if unchecked, can take over at an alarming rate. But there is at least one thing we can be grateful for.
Fortunately, it's not contagious, but obviously other infections can be. So it's really important that actually we control the rate of infection, so good hand washing. Obviously, for people that have got contagious infections, we isolate them, so they're not obviously of a danger to other people on the ward.
The thing about sepsis, and infection in general, of course, is that it knows no boundaries. It can affect anyone. I know this only too well. But to be honest, I think I actually got off quite lightly, especially compared to others who've been left permanently damaged and disabled. People like Yaku Nell, whose story of sepsis makes me realise how lucky I was. Just under 2 years ago, Yaku was playing with his dog Harvey and noticed a cut on his hand. He washed it, but 2 weeks later began to feel, like I did, aching, shivery and feeling really unwell. Yaku's partner knew something wasn't right and called for the paramedics.
So what they did was they immediately put a drip up because my blood pressure was low and I was dehydrated. And they put me downstairs into the ambulance and immediately started treating me with antibiotics even before I got to the hospital. They were pretty sure I had developed sepsis.
But they had to find out what specific infection he had in order to treat it. Unfortunately, each blood test they took in the intensive care unit came back negative. Time was running out, and so were Yaku's options.
By then they'd phoned my family to say that it was very serious. So my sister flew over from South Africa. She didn't think I was going to make it. Well, nobody thought I was going to make it.
Despite an arsenal of medication, Yaku's condition continued to deteriorate. And for a while, it seemed that he was too far gone. Soon, the blood supply to the extremities of his body was shutting down.
And I got gangrene of my fingers and my legs, so they turned completely black.
Finally, the doctors discovered the source of the infection. It was bacteria from his dog's saliva that had invaded his body from the tiny cut on his hand.
That was a shock as well, to realise that, you know, from such a tiny, insignificant thing, my whole life has changed.
A little over 4 months since the deadly bacteria from the dog's saliva had entered his body, Yaku began a series of operations. He had both his legs amputated below the knee. He lost all fingers on his right hand and one on his left, and needed reconstructive surgery on his face.
I got very low in mood, extremely depressed. And there were times where I didn't think I wanted to carry on.
And yet, with the constant help and support from the NHS, as well as family and friends, Yaku managed to overcome what to most of us would be an insurmountable hurdle.
Just the encouragement and the love of all these people made me realise that there's no way you're going to kill yourself. That's not the way forward. So I'm eternally grateful to these people. And I'm able to be happy again. Yeah.
Now, although this show is called Matron, Medicine and Me, it's also about matron, medicine and you, which is why across the series we're travelling the country in our ambulance fleet to hear the incredible stories of people the NHS has helped or even saved. First of all, we meet people who, just like me, have experienced the NHS through the microscopic lens of infections. Aaron Baird and his mother Morag in Dumfries had a too close for comfort brush with sepsis.
Well, basically Aaron was at college doing his greenkeeping exams and he took ill on the Wednesday with a temperature.
When I got to home, I just burst out crying, which wasn't like me. And I said to Mum, there's something really not right here, and that we went into hospital. Like all the X-rays and things were fine.
Sepsis, as we've seen, can be difficult to diagnose, but Morag returned to the hospital with Aaron later that night. He was coughing up blood and had a temperature of over 40 degrees.
They said that they were going to have to ventilate Aaron, and I just couldn't believe it. He was put on the ventilator and they took him around to the intensive care unit.
As the infections he had were so widespread, Aaron's organs were shutting down. The only treatment consultants could offer to save his life was to use a procedure where the blood is drained from his body and returned with fresh oxygen. It was dangerous, and the consultant told Morag to prepare for the worst.
I knew if I didn't do it and take the chance, that it wouldn't survive anyway, and I'm so glad we did take the chance, because we're here today to tell the story.
And the initial infection? Influenza A, plus a few others.
Pneumonia and septicemia you had, and then you had Haemophilus, Staph aureus and Legionella.
I'm never going to remember all of that. Never.
In 2013, Sadia Rafiq in Manchester had to have a kidney transplant, but it was the fear of what an infection could do to her as a consequence that concerned the doctors.
It took time, any infection, any flus and anything, just a little sniff, they said you can't go home. At one point I was ready to go home, but something happened, the levels dropped. There's a statistic level where they have to match it, and it dropped. They go, sorry, we can't go home, you've got to stay for another week. Because it could end up killing me, couldn't it?
But even when she was allowed to return home, the precautions against exposure to infection were massive.
Don't go around open spaces, don't go around don't eat anything from outside restaurants, takeaway. Don't have many visitors with flowers, don't have one-by-one visitors. And you had to go in every day back and forth to Manchester for a week. Then after that it was every 3 days, then every 5 days until you got better.
The vigilance, however, has paid off, giving Sadia a new life with her family. And it's the responsibility she feels towards her donor's family that gives her an extra impetus to stay well, and they appreciate it.
I get a phone call every year telling me they want to know how I'm doing, how my blood results are, and how am I getting on.
And for Sadia, she has this thought about the NHS.
It's been fantastic. I can't tell you how grateful I am to the NHS.
Of course, the effects from infection are much worse in those whose immune system isn't as strong as it should be. Like Nia Hughes's premature baby, who had to fight for his life at only 6 weeks old.
We were put in a side room, and then one of the doctors took one look at him, and that was it. He'd stopped breathing, his temperature was 32 degrees. Because he was so cold, they couldn't find any veins to put any antibiotics in, so they had to drill into his leg bone to administer the antibiotics. And there was a lot of doctors, a lot of nurses, and they took a lot of time, a lot of care, a lot of attention.
Sepsis had been diagnosed. Nia and her family stood vigil over baby Carter in the special care unit, desperately hoping for the antibiotics to work.
He can't tell you what's wrong or how he's feeling and things like that, so it was especially tough because he'd just been born. You don't expect something like that. You don't expect sepsis or anything majorly wrong, even though he was born quite prematurely.
After 3 long days, baby Carter began to show signs of improvement. The antibiotics were working.
He was in for 3 weeks, and he just grew stronger and stronger through their amazing care, and we're so incredibly lucky to have him here and to have the NHS, really, to be quite honest, and all the people that helped him.
Today, I'm looking at how the National Health Service is combating its original and biggest enemy, germs. E. coli is a particularly vicious one and very nearly cost me my life. So I want to see how NHS medicine has evolved in the fight against those malicious microbes. And what better place to come than the Royal London Hospital, Bart's Health. This was founded in 1740, but now houses one of the most cutting-edge laboratories in the country. It has over about 2 million samples to test every month.
This place has been at the front line of the NHS's war against infection. And I want to find out more. So, meeting me for a walk down medical memory lane is Professor Finbar Cotter, the Clinical Director of Pathology here at the Royal London Hospital. Of course, if one is to blend in here, one is required to dress for the occasion. We've been given special access to visit the place where blood samples are tested and analysed. If something like sepsis is going to be found, it's in a place like this.
Finbar, what's your job up here? What's happening in this room?
Well, this room is the blood sciences room, where we do all the blood tests for the whole of the East End of London. 70,000 blood tests a day.
Really?
Yes, and 70 years ago we would take a bottle and treat each of them individually. We could never have dealt with the numbers that we deal with now.
The medical fight against infectious disease really began before the NHS got underway. It was a British man who made the first significant breakthrough in the guise of Alexander Fleming, whose discovery of penicillin in 1928 was the first major blow against infection. However, it was the NHS that allowed this miracle drug to be distributed to all of Britain, especially its poor. And in the wake of World War II, it couldn't have come at a better time.
You think 70 years back, bugs had not seen antibiotics at all before.
So they were ready to be wiped out?
They were ready to respond to relatively simple antibiotics, yes.
Post-war, of course, there was a housing crisis. And presumably living close together and in the slums, there was an awful lot of infection going on.
And the more confined those cities are, the quicker epidemics of infections can spread.
One of these epidemics was polio, which became the NHS's first major public health issue. Nearly 8,000 new cases were diagnosed each year, with around 750 deaths. The Health Service launched a nationwide vaccination programme that rather cleverly involved people eating a lump of sugar, which contained a few drops of the vaccine.
Polio was one of the major scourges of the NHS, and it was virtually eradicated over a period of 10 to 15 years by the use of the vaccination programmes.
For generations of children, getting their vaccinations is one of our first experiences of the NHS. After all, who can forget nervously lining up to get the BCG from the school nurse? And the results were amazing. Not just polio, but smallpox, measles and TB were all brought under control by the NHS. And even HIV, the most recent infectious epidemic, has been tamed.
When you got HIV, you died often within a few months of developing it. That's the 80s to now, where we've got the antivirals, which we give in a combination of 2 or 3 different types. And we expect HIV not to shorten your life, significantly these days. And that should be your expectation.
So the war has been won, right? Well, not so fast. Because today there is a brand new problem for the NHS to tackle. It's the rise of the superbug.
We're now under the gloom of the superbug that will not respond to antibiotics.
Absolutely. And the reality is that we went from, first of all, treating early in the NHS days the bugs, the common things that killed people and killed children, usually under the age of 5, to then giving them for your hip replacement so that you didn't get an infection, which would, of course, ruin your hip replacement. That sort of
so
operation.
Done as prevention, not cure.
Done prevention rather than cure.
Can you see a day when the superbug might win?
I think we will always try and keep one step ahead, but it's a lot of hard work.
For 70 years, the NHS have been on the front battling infection and germs with antibiotics, vaccines and antiviral drugs. And here, at the Royal London, the campaign rages on. But as Reza, the divisional manager of the haematology testing lab, tells me, each vial of blood is very much a real person.
Do you think about the human stories behind these?
Yeah, I think, when
when we run the patient samples, we know that there's a patient behind each one of those samples.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you see here with the commitment of the staff that we've got is, you know, we run each patient as if it was one of our own family members. So, you know, I think that's the commitment that comes with running a pathology service.
Although you'll never meet that person, this is very, very personal to them.
Indeed.
When my bloods were tested 2 years ago, they found signs of the infection that would have killed me. But to discover what specific bacteria or virus was responsible for this, my samples would have gone to the microbiology lab, like this one, where Melvin has quite literally seen it all.
I think I've seen everything in the textbook now, from leprosy. I haven't seen rabies, that's the one I haven't ticked off.
Well, I'm glad that you haven't.
Well, it's part of what we do.
Yeah, but there is no rabies in the UK.
Not in the UK now, no.
That's good, but things were abroad. I mean, the Ebola virus, for instance, that's again cropped up in the news.
Yes.
And is that does that make your blood run cold to think it's come back, or is it somehow part of the process of the virus?
I don't say it because it's my speciality, but infection is mankind's worst enemy, and it's accounted for a greater loss of life over the centuries more than probably anything else. So we always need to be on our guard, and we always need to be ready for the next wave that hits us.
So the blood test I had when I first arrived in hospital with the sepsis, they very quickly identified it as E. coli.
Yes.
So would my blood sample have gone through exactly this process?
These sort of processes, yes, it's fairly standard.
Basically, they place the specimen on the Petri dish, which has jelly and blood for a food source. After a few hours, there are millions of cultured bacteria grown, and the scientists can identify them by their shape.
The other thing we look for, which is as important as identifying the organisms, is treating them. So the doctor needs to know which antibiotic is going to kill those bacteria. So again, it's an old traditional method. What we do is we impregnate filter paper disc with the antibiotic. And I don't know if you can see that against a dark background.
Yes.
You can see the antibiotics inhibited the growth. So we can see that these particular antibiotics would be effective. And here we've got one where you can see that particular antibiotic is not so successful. The organism has grown up to the disc, so we would advise the doctor not to treat with that particular antibiotic.
That was really quite an eye-opener, wasn't it? I suppose those faceless they, you know, you send off some samples and someone comes back with them. But did you imagine it was all those really passionate people working at their machines and loving what they're doing and fascinated by all those horrific infections? And there is still a lot more to do.
To patients, of course, all this science saves lives. Of the 200,000 diagnosed with sepsis last year in the UK, at least 80% were treated successfully with antibiotics. I'm going to meet another member of what I call the Sepsis Survivors Club, here at the Royal London Barts, Asad and his sister, Muniba.
I'm so glad you're both here, because there's an awful lot of this story, Asad, you don't remember, isn't there?
19-year-old Asad was sick on a bus on his way back to the student lodgings. He fell asleep for most of the day, but then was found by classmates weak and delirious in the corridor.
When the ambulance was called, the paramedics measured me in about 40 degrees. So I was extremely...
40 degrees?
Yeah, so I was
That's very serious, isn't it?
Asad's sister Muniba was the first to join her brother at the emergency ward.
He was completely unresponsive. He wasn't talking. He wasn't responding to me.
Were his eyes
open? His eyes were closed. He couldn't hear anything. I was kind of doing this around his head and he just wasn't responding.
The blood test revealed meningitis, and Asad was immediately sent to intensive care.
We were told to put on these masks and these gloves.
Before you went in there to be with him?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Infection control.
Exactly. And then he's lying in bed, and me and my sister noticed that he had kind of red rashes around his knees, his legs, his arms, and that's when they confirmed that it was sepsis. And they said the next 48 hours were going to be difficult and to hold our ground. And they also said, we'll get your brother better. And I think for us as a family, at that point, it was what we needed to hear.
And 2 days later, after being treated with antibiotics, Asad started to respond, and his recovery began.
You walked out of the doors 4 weeks ago today.
Absolutely, yeah, and that walk was completely unassisted, and I'm sure I could have done more, which is incredible. Yeah, I think it wouldn't be safe for me to do more, but I probably could.
Well, thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You've joined the Sepsis Survivors Club. Hooray, hooray.
So far, we've seen how the NHS has waged a war against infectious diseases since it started 70 years ago. And so far, it's winning. Just. But sophisticated medicine and vaccinations aren't the only weapons being used. There's also a far simpler and cheaper form of preventing the pathogens from spreading. As in Guy's in London, it starts with a simple squeeze.
Coming into any modern hospital now, you'll find these peppered around at the ends of either ward, and it's a hand sanitizer. Now, the idea, of course, is to stop the germs from the outside world coming into the ward and then infecting the patients. So, here I go. Ready for the ward?
The NHS vastly increased the number of hand sanitizers throughout its hospitals nearly 15 years ago, undoubtedly helping in the battle against bugs. But for NHS workers, they can't just depend on being saved by the gel alone.
This is one of the NHS's cleaning manuals, 174 pages of instruction and tips on how to keep the environment spotless. So, I'm going to read you this one. Hand and wrist jewellery can harbour microorganisms and can reduce compliance with hand hygiene. It is good practice to remove wristwatches and jewellery at the beginning of the shift. Better take my watch off, huh?
Of course, in the old days, it was Matron who was in charge of keeping things spick and span, and she, because it was usually a she, ruled over proceedings with an iron rod. So who's in charge of that today? I'm meeting lead nurse Shona to find out how the NHS keeps clean and carries on.
In the olden days, and people my age look back and go, well, when there was a matron in charge of every ward at every hospital, and when visiting hours were kept to a minimum and infection wasn't being walked in and out, things were better. But is that true?
Not exactly. Infections possibly weren't monitored in the same way, and the scrutiny hospitals are under is much more now, which is a good thing. But the other thing is our ward managers, sisters, charge nurses are in charge of how their clinical environments are cleaned, but they work collaboratively with our housekeeping teams.
Whilst this applies to services and wards, there are equally stringent controls for personnel too when it comes to fighting infection and battling bugs.
Our hospital takes a view of being bare below the elbows, and the reason for that is we can wash or clean our hands properly, because if you wear a watch it gets very wet underneath and it's not very pleasant, and we want to protect our staff but also stop them transmitting infection to our patients. You have to be fit for duty.
Oh yes, exactly that, exactly
and
that.
we need to keep our staff healthy.
You also have to be very fit to carry this enormous manual around, but hand washing has always been key. That's the message.
Of course, I've been washing my hands for many a year now and think I'm pretty good at it. But Shona insists that there may be one or two tricks I don't know about. So, time to get NHS clean.
So the first and most important step is you must wet your hands first. Because if you put soap straight onto dry hands, you'll strip all that lovely natural oils that you have in your skin.
Okay, hands are wet.
And then get a couple of pumps of soap. Yeah. So first you're coming palm to palm. And fingers into it, and just make sure you're touching the whole time. And this part of the technique really helps get into those creases in the hands, but also into the knuckles. And then we come to our thumbs, and then we come to in here, because obviously they've got creases, and we like to get into those nooks and crannies. And then finally up to your wrists to then finish off the hand washing technique. And then we rinse.
Ooh.
Yeah. And then it's very important to dry your hands properly afterwards. So because wet hands can carry microorganisms to the patient.
Thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome.
Time to go back on the road to hear some more stories about matron, medicine and you. So what else do the streets of Britain have to say? Well, a lot of us, it seems, have been rushed to hospital in an emergency. First up, Maxine Greaves in Sheffield has an ambulance anecdote which was so acute she couldn't even wait to get to the hospital.
I was actually born in an ambulance on the way to the hospital. Not a done thing in those days, but my mum says, you know, I've always been on the move, and one of the things that she's fond memories of the NHS is the fact that the ambulance crew turned up, took control. She thought I was going to arrive actually in the hospital, but I didn't get that far, and I was delivered by the ambulance crew themselves. So thumbs up to them. They did a wonderful job. I'm living proof of that.
And whilst Maxine doesn't recall the ambulance staff, obviously she does have something very personal to remember them by.
I'm named after one of the ambulance crew guys, so if you're out there, Max, thank you very much.
Someone who did make it to hospital twice is Claire in Manchester. After being discharged following an operation for an ovarian cyst, Claire became very ill and was readmitted to hospital with suspected sepsis, just like me.
I was in a lot of pain. Now, or whether that was because of the operation or the septicemia, I don't know.
Claire had an immediate emergency operation to remove the cause of the sepsis. And whilst it did save her life, there was a high price to pay.
I had to take my tube and my ovar because of it. So I ended up with one over and one tube.
When I had my surgery, I had so many doubts as to how it would turn out. But Claire has no doubts when it comes to the NHS's aftercare.
The aftercare was brilliant. The staff are amazing. They did everything for me and all that.
And finally, another post-operative success story comes from Sam in Sheffield, who without the NHS's intervention wouldn't be here today. Sounds oh so familiar.
The NHS saved my life. I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis in 2004 and was managed on medication for 9 years, and then unfortunately got really poorly, ended up in hospital and had my entire large intestine removed. Through blogging I've got lots of pictures of me in hospital. I talk a lot about having lots of scars because I'm really proud of what I've been through.
And Sam believes her recovery wasn't just down to her own positive frame of mind.
It's not only the care of the consultants and the doctors and the nurses, but just everyone in that hospital surrounding. The lady who makes your tea, when she remembers how you like your brew, it's just absolutely wonderful. It makes you feel like you're a real person, that you're not just a number on a piece of paper.
I'm spending the afternoon at Guy's Hospital in London, where I'm finding out how, when it comes to fighting infection, cleanliness is a major weapon. So far, I've had a thorough NHS-approved hand wash, but now it's time to take things to another level. With a cleaning bill for all hospitals in the UK of around £1 billion per year, hygiene is in the vanguard of the NHS's campaign against germs. And ultimately, it's the armies of cleaners who are the foot soldiers in this war. I'm joining Supervisor of the North Wing area, Argida, to help get a new ward ready.
There's obviously a route of which way you work first. You go top to bottom?
We are going to start with top to bottom, inside, outside, clean to dirty. That is the procedure.
Clean to dirty, obviously. Yes. OK.
15 years or so ago, the housekeeping staff in the NHS used traditional disposable mops and cloths. But now they are all microfiber, and there's a specific scientific reason for that.
This cloth trap everything, bacteria, virus, inside.
But then I've noticed this is cold and damp, and at home we do it in hot water and soap and things.
It's better to do with cold water because that is when it traps everything in there. If the cloth is warm, it's like expand and release, everything is in there.
Ah, so when the fibres are cold and tight, they trap it. Ah, OK, good.
And when mopping the floor, it's crucial to get into the nooks and crannies of the corners where the dirt and germs gather.
And then I do this. So microfiber, disinfectant, cold water to do it in, And then I go like this, and then I go like that. It's like taking off your knickers at night. Flip them up in the air and catch them. Have you ever done that? Yes.
Of course, it wouldn't be the 21st century without 21st century technology. And that's exactly what the rapid response team use here at Guy's and many other hospitals in the UK when entire rooms have to be disinfected. And rapid response supervisor Joseph is here to show me how this Star Warsian machine works, if there is such a word.
So on our little pad here,
Yeah.
we're just going to start the machine.
This is a UV machine that kills the likes of MRSA, C. diff, and even the germ that practically did the same to me, E. coli. So I won't be shedding tears when Joseph turns it on and the UV light sterilises the room.
And then there's a bit of a delay, is there? So you
Yeah.
get up. Humans aren't allowed in the room at the
That's
same
it,
time.
humans ain't allowed in the room.
OK, I'm moving out.
Evacuate. And there it is.
Are we allowed to look through the glass, I said?
Yep, so what the light does is hitting the glass, but just bouncing off again.
Mm-hmm.
And also, you might notice a bit of a smell afterwards, but that's
Oh.
just because the dust particles in the air is being burnt by the light.
And it's not hitting the ceiling, but does that matter?
No, when you get a patient with an infection, infection usually sits on a flat surface, so it will
Gravity.
drop. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Gravity
okay.
will hold it down instead of raising it up.
Interesting.
We've certainly come a long way from coughs and sneezes spreading diseases. But it's all essentially the same message, isn't it? Prevention is ultimately always better than cure when it comes to infection. And who knows, maybe I can apply some of these tips when next I clean my own house. Or at least pass them on to my husband. It's nearly the end of my Matron, Medicine and Me road trip, and it's been everything I hoped for. From meeting those who kept me alive,
You saved me, because it could easily have gone wrong, and it didn't.
to those who faced death.
They said the next 48 hours were going to be difficult.
And I learned how the NHS is working night and day to keep us well. And how well we can keep ourselves. But before I go home, however, I want to pop back to where my life was saved, Stoke Mandeville Hospital. And I'm bringing something for Deborah to remember me by.
Now, do you know what this is?
It's a fern.
It is, and I heard you are a bit of a gardener.
I am.
Well, look after that.
Oh,
I
bless
think
you.
it'll be easier than looking after me. So thank you very
You're
much
most
indeed.
welcome.
I think I'm going to get you a cup of tea now.
That
Fancy a
sounds
cup
good.
of tea? Yeah. Okay, come on then. So what I've learnt here is that the NHS's battle against germs is being fought across all levels. But we still have to beat the superbug, so we mustn't forget to wash our hands. And also, do remember, coughs and sneezes still spread diseases.
If you love a good crime drama, look no further than Red Rock. It's back for a new series at 2:45. Tonight, Panorama meets families whose kids have serious disabilities. How do you give them a decent quality of life? That's at 8:30. Next, Homes Under the Hammer.